So where do you fall in the war between literary fiction and romance? Why do people get so weird when you try to use the term literary romance? That is a question that I've had on my mind for quite a few weeks, if not months, if not years. As someone whose two favorite genres are literary fiction and romance, I have had this kind of swirling around in my brain for the longest time, and I have talked to a lot of different people about this. I've seen and witnessed so many other conversations about this specific topic, and I am always kind of left a little bit conflicted. So in this video, I wanted to talk about literary fiction, romance, and the ways in which they can intersect, and also some of the assumptions that each fandom of each genre has about the other, some of the genre snobberies, and overall where the term literary romance might be able to fit in to this conversation between both of these genres. So to begin, what are literary fiction and romance? What are those as genres? So when we talk about literary fiction, we're mostly talking about some sort of general fiction, but it is mainly going to be focusing on characterization and the inner turmoil or conflict within that character. In a literary fiction novel, you're going to focus a lot more on artistry and craft and discussions of theme instead of plot or usage of tropes. Here I have some examples of literary fiction that are on my shelves. I have Such a Fun Age by Reid. We have Normal People by Sally Rooney. That is probably going to be what most people think of when they hear literary fiction. I have Autumn by Ali Smith, and then I also have Evil Eye by etaf. So those are going to be kind of what people think of when they typically hear literary fiction. Literary fiction as a genre is kind of hard to pin down and really hard to define because it is kind of a generalized idea. There's not really specific tropes or themes or defining qualities that one would be able to point to and be like, oh, that is what literary fiction is. It's a much more generalized idea. It can apply to a lot of different kinds of books, and I think you will see a lot of overlap between literary fiction and other genres like horror or even fantasy or sci-fi. It's just one of those type of genres that can kind of be utilized wherever. And then I think most people are pretty aware of what the romance genre is, but if you didn't know, the romance genre is one that focuses mainly on interpersonal relationships, specifically romantic relationships between two characters, or in some other cases maybe even more, and you are going to see their relationship play out, and it will typically wrap up with either a happily ever after or a happy for now. And I also have some examples of romance books on my shelves. I have The Kiss Quotient by Helen Hoang. I have Love Theoretically by Hazelwood. I have Get a Life Chloe Brown by Thalia Hibbert, and then I also have If the Shoe Fits by Julie Murphy. So when this conversation usually pops up, I see a lot of people that are very much on either side. Either they are very strictly romance readers or they are very strictly literary fiction readers. And this always begs a question to me as why are these two genres seen kind of by both parties as incompatible? Because to me, as somebody who loves both genres, they feel very, very intertwined and obvious co-conspirators. They're both very versatile genres with pretty vague parameters, and I feel like with both literary fiction and with romance, they are both heavily focused on character development, characterization, character exploration, and also themes. Whereas literary fiction kind of can delve into a lot of different types of themes. With romance, you typically see themes of romance, of love, of friendship, things like that. Family dynamics kind of overlap in both genres. And so to me, I just cannot understand how people view them as so incompatible. But I do think that the history of both of these genres kind of being pitted against each other does not help in trying to marry these two genres, because often you will see the reality of the romance genre being looked down upon across the board throughout the entire bookish community. And that is something that has been going on for decades and decades, if not even centuries, because you can go back so far into history and look at the ways that books by Jane Austen or the Bronte sisters or any other type of author similar to that, how they were also looked down upon for writing romance into their books. But I also think that it's important to like see that history, but also remember that the history of the novel is very, very similar, just like in general. Of the novel has not always been something that was highly regarded, regardless of the stories that were being told within the novels. Like, the concept of a novel has historically been looked down upon in a very similar way as romance has been looked down upon. But as the novel started to gain a little bit more legitimacy, there definitely was that distinction of a literary type of novel, and then the idea that a romance focused novel was lesser than. And I think that with romance as a genre and its history of continually being looked down upon, I feel like that really contributed to the way that romance as a community has been built and also been very insular. Because of so much of the literary elitism and the romance prejudice, I feel like the romance community has sort of built a wall around itself and sort of morphed into its own echo chamber. And for me, I see this a lot when the romance community creates these rules and parameters around what constitutes a romance book, and those rules and parameters seem to change at will. And I think that this is a reaction to the ways in which people outside of the genre have been really critical of romance and what they feel like it represents, or how they feel like it's lesser than. And so the people in the romance community feel like they need to be overly protective of what romance is and the community that they've built. So when they see books that are kind of being labeled as more literary despite being romances, they start to get a little bit defensive. And to me that makes sense, because there is so much kind of like sensitivity around the word literary, and there is that desire to shield the romance community, the romance genre, from any sort of that like criticism from literary fanatics. However, I feel like it can kind of turn around and harm a lot of like romance authors and romance readers, because it starts to feel very echo chambery, because any dissenting opinion or idea can lead to the book, the author, the fans being shunned from the romance community. As someone who reads a lot of romance and has engaged in the romance community, it can sometimes feel like you're playing a game of catch up constantly. Like you're constantly trying to figure out what the rules are today and what the parameters for a romance novel are today, what you are supposed to say, what you aren't supposed to say, the opinions you're supposed to have, the opinions you're not supposed to have. And it can feel like you're a little bit lost and like the romance community isn't for you. And I think that it really is a protective reaction. It really is a way for the romance community to kind of gather itself, kind of build that community, and shield it from literally any other dissenting opinion. And then you see these romance books that are being published as romance books, shelved as romance books, promoted and advertised as romance books, being published under imprints that are romance focused. You see these books being called not romance books by romance readers just because it had the audacity to not stick to whatever the very strict and rigid parameters that are being set by the community. And these rules and parameters are just very arbitrary. It feels like a lot of times they are created and set according to how much the community does or doesn't like that author on that given day, or does or doesn't like that book on that given day. It doesn't feel like there is a lot of room to be slightly different or try something a little bit more experimental within the romance genre. It feels like you really do have to subscribe specifically to what the romance community believes on that given day. And funnily enough, I do actually think that there is sort of that same mentality within the literary fiction genre. I have seen so many times, specifically with female authors, where the literary fiction genre will shun those female authors or shun those books that are centered around a female character and call them something else, or say that they're not literary fiction, because of those arbitrary and ridiculous parameters that they have set for the literary fiction genre. So it's kind of like, if you're an author that falls in between that literary fiction and romance arena, you're kind of left without any sort of community claiming you, all because you've decided to do something a little bit different. And I think that that's something that really the book community has always struggled with, in a way. The book community in general does not like change. It doesn't like experimenting. It doesn't like doing things a little bit differently or having a different opinion. You see that also with the romantasy genre of people who are strictly fantasy readers feeling like romantasy isn't real fantasy, or having these like ridiculous parameters around what is romantasy. Like, I can't figure it out, and most other people can't agree on a specific definition of what romantasy is. So it's kind of like, one person might say this book is romantasy, and then other people will be like, that's absolutely not romantasy, this is romantasy. And then another group of people will be like, that's not romantasy, this is romantasy. It's like, there's so many arbitrary parameters that are happening within the bookish space that it's like, what are we doing at this point? I feel like it's like a very unique version of self-policing, because we're so dedicated to the purity of genre, the purity of this is what this is, and it can never ever ever be this other thing, lest the entire world blow up. And so then you have books like Conversations with Friends, or Beach Read, or Just for the Summer, or You Again, or any kind of books like that, sort of falling into this space of like, where do they go? Are they romance? Are they literary fiction? Who's gonna claim them? And why can't there be this sort of overlapping subgenre of literary romance? And I think the question that a lot of people have when it comes to the term literary romance is, can this term help elevate romance, or is it seen as patronizing? And I think for a lot of people it is seen as patronizing, mainly because of the history of the romance genre being looked down upon and seen as something that lacks literary merit. So I feel like for a lot of people who are very much romance purists, they will see the term literary romance and feel like the people who are using it in a derogatory sense against romance. However, for others, they tend to use the term literary romance just as any other subgenre, just like romantasy or historical romance or things like that, where there doesn't seem to be that sort of like heavily charged emotion around those subgenres. I think for me and a lot of other people, we want to be able to normalize the term literary romance and kind of take away some of those negative reactions to that term. Because for me, as someone who loves romance and who really respects romance authors and romance books, I don't think that that romance as a genre needs to be elevated. And I personally don't believe that the term literary can at all elevate romance as a genre. I don't think that that is the intention. And personally, I feel like it is a little bit of a misconception as to what literary fiction is. It kind of almost supposes that literary fiction in general is better than romance, which kind of seems to defeat the purpose of trying to argue that romance is just as good as literary fiction. And to me, a subgenre isn't necessarily saying these books are set apart in a good or a bad way. It's just in a different way. Like, you would never look at a romantasy book and be like, oh, that's better than romance, or oh, that's worse than romance. Or you would never look at like a historical romance and be like, that's better than romance, or that's worse than romance. You know what I mean? And so I would love to see this sort of truce between literary fiction and romance and see the two come together, because I feel like they have so much more in common than they do otherwise, because there are plenty of literary fiction books that are just absolutely terrible. There are plenty of romance books that are just absolutely terrible. There are plenty of romance books that are incredible works of art that are just like breathtaking and life-changing and have affected me emotionally on such a deep level. And then there are plenty of literary fiction novels that have done the exact same. So I feel like there is this false air around the term literary fiction that is kind of placed upon it by both sides. For the fans of literary fiction, they put upon this air of like superiority and worthy of the highest merit, and they do it because they love the genre. Whereas with more romance-centric fans, they put that air upon it in a more negative way. And I feel like we just need to destigmatize the term literary fiction. We need to divorce it from this idea of like old white men who don't care about women, who don't care about romance, who don't care about feeling or emotion. Because there are so many incredible literary fiction authors who are women, who are people of color, who are queer, who come from any type of marginalization. And I feel like when romance readers look down upon literary fiction and try to I guess give it a taste of its own medicine, I feel like they are unintentionally disregarding so many of the marginalized voices within the literary fiction space. So while I understand the desire to sort of protect and attack, at the end of the day it starts to sound a little bit like, I know you are, but what am I? I know you are, but what am I? Like, from both sides. And I'm just like, why are we still having this argument? Why are we still having this competition? I would love to see less reactionary takes. I would love to see less of the us versus them mentality. I would love to see less of the strict parameters that both of these genres place upon their authors and their readers. And like I said, there's so many incredible books in both genres. One is not better than the other. One doesn't have more literary merit than the other. And I think that it can be a little bit misleading when one of the genres is called literary fiction. It's not necessarily referring to the literary merit of those books. It's referring to the literary devices that are used in those books. So it is a little bit of like a misleading term, because I feel like when people hear literary fiction, they hear literary merit. And I'm like, it's more so talking about like the literary devices of like characterization and theme and things like that. It's not necessarily insinuating that it has more literary merit than any other genre. So at the end of the day, I feel like these two genres could really do some incredible things together. I would love to see more normalization of the term literary romance. I would love to see less people looking at these more like literary leaning romance books and stop calling them women's fiction, stop calling them general fiction, stop calling them literary fiction. It's a romance book. I hate to break it to you, but Emily Henry writes romance books. Whether you like it or not, she writes romance books. They might have a more literary fiction leaning, but that doesn't make them anything less than a romance book. And talking to all of the literary fiction nerds, Sally Rooney is literary fiction. Because I hear this a lot too. I feel like there's like these two sides of the coins with like Emily Henry books and then Sally Rooney books. The literary fiction nerds will look at a Sally Rooney book and say, that's not literary fiction, that's romance or whatever. And then romance nerds will be like, that's Emily Henry doesn't write romance, she writes literary fiction or whatever. And I'm like, you guys are having the same issues. You guys are having the same issues. You guys think you're so different, but you guys are really so similar. And that's the funny part to me as someone who loves both genres. It's like, you guys are basically that like Spider-Man meme where it's like they're pointing at each other. Like, yeah, that's you. That's literary fiction and romance. And honestly, if the literary fiction nerds and the romance nerds could get along, I feel like that would water my crops, clear my skin, everything would be great. So my question to all of you is, what do you think about this topic? I want to know. I want to hear everybody's takes. I think that there is a case to be made on every side. And is anyone else like me and is tired of all the genre fighting, infighting, cross-fighting, everything like that? I'm kind of over it at this point. I want everybody to kind of be able to kiss and make up and get along. So yeah, let me know what your thoughts are down below in the comments, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It was really fun to make. I had like my little notes and outline right here, so I had a really great time coming up with this idea and thinking about it and thinking about both genres that I love so much. So I hope you all enjoyed this video, and if you did, go ahead and give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Also, go ahead and follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Goodreads, Storygraph, TikTok. All of the links are down below, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye!